On the 24th of July 1915, the old steamer Prince Charles pushed through grey Atlantic waves about 140 miles southwest of Ireland, her hull streaked with salt and her single smokestack throwing out dark coal smoke that showed her age and weakness as she moved it, perhaps 8 knots at most, and through the periscope of Captain Lieutenant Otto Steinbrink of U-36. She seemed nothing more than an easy target, a helpless merchant of 373 tons, riding high and empty, and offering no threat at all. So he followed the usual practice. Such prey and prepared to surface and sink her with gunfire instead of wasting a torpedo that cost the equivalent of £1,000 and required precise firing calculations, yet what he could not see beneath those worn planks were 4 hidden 12-pounder guns with their trained crews. Crouched in total silence under the command of Gordon Campbell, a naval officer who had drilled his men for months for this exact moment, and when U-36 rose to the surface only 800 yards from the port side, the Prince Charles dropped her false panels and the guns swung into view. And Campbell gave the order to fire, and the first rounds tore into the conning tower, striking it twice before the submarine could dive. And though U-36 attempted to flee, she resurfaced 35 minutes later, mortally damaged, and the British gunners fired again and finished her, and she went down with all hands. And this dramatic moment was not an accident, but the opening move in one of the boldest deceptions in naval warfare, the Q-ship campaign, where the Royal Navy disguised armed vessels as weak merchants, and flipped the rules of submarine warfare by making the hunter the hunted. And though the idea sounded insane on paper, sending disguised warships into waters ruled by German submarines and relying on the enemy to approach close enough to be killed, the strategy would become a central element of British defense between 1915 and 1918, when they deployed 366 Q ships that accounted for 11 confirmed submarine kills and serious damage to many more. And the very vulnerability of these ships, their rust, their slow speed, their battered appearance, was not a weakness but the heart of the tactic. And by late 1914, the threat of German submarines had grown far beyond what the Royal Navy expected, for naval planners had believed that submarines would mostly serve as coastal guards, too fragile, and with too little range to operate across the Atlantic. Yet they were proven wrong, for the German Type U-31 class entering service in 1915 could stay out for 6 weeks and travel at 16 knots on the surface, and carried 16 torpedoes plus an 88mm deck gun. And because each torpedo was expensive, the submarine crews preferred surface gun attacks on small unarmed ships, which allowed them to preserve torpedoes for harder targets, and so a single U-boat could sink many cargo ships with gunfire alone. And the usual practice involved surfacing 800 to 1200 yards away, ordering the merchant crew to abandon ship, and then destroying the vessel methodically with deck gun. And this pattern created a dangerous weakness for the submarine, for while it sat exposed on the surface firing at a helpless ship, it was just as vulnerable as any surface vessel, and far more fragile, for the pressure hull of a U-31 was built to withstand water pressure at 50 meters, not the destructive force of a 12-pound shell which could rip open the hull with deadly effect. And yet standard anti-submarine doctrine focused on destroyers' depth charges and hydrophones as they hunted submarines underwater, where they were almost invisible. And so the question emerged: what if instead of chasing submarines below the surface, you made them choose to surface willingly and attack? And what if their preferred method of shelling easy prey became the very trap that killed them? And the Admiralty found its answer in the creation of HMS Farnborough, commissioned in March 1915 as the first purpose-built Q ship, starting life as the Collier Lauder, built in 1895. Weighing 2,400 tons, exactly the type of vessel U-boats attacked every week, and naval engineers stripped her interior and installed 4 12-pounder guns behind hinged panels, a 6-pounder hidden in the stern, and a 3-pounder disguised as cargo, and her crew of 65 wore merchant clothes and lived in miserable conditions, so that every detail looked authentic. And she was registered as a merchantman, and her radio stayed silent except for distress calls, and she even released oil to mimic engine trouble. And every inch of her signaled weakness, and critics inside the Admiralty believed this was reckless, and that it sent brave men to their deaths, for the success of the tactic relied on enemy commanders making mistakes. Yet the truth was different, for the Q ship worked not because of luck, but because of an intricate performance that demanded absolute discipline under fire. And when a U-boat surfaced, the Q-ship crew carried out the panic party drill, where 5 to 8 men rushed about the deck in fake terror, lowering a boat with clumsy effort and rowing away frantically, carrying forged papers that matched the false identity of the ship, and their clothing was genuine merchant gear, and many officers even learned Norwegian or Danish phrases in case the submarine crew questioned them, and a member of HMS Dunraven remembered that they had to look truly terrified, because if the boat launched too smoothly, or if the panic seemed fake, the submarine would suspect a trap and dive, and then months of preparation would be wasted. And while the panic party sold the illusion, the rest of the crew hid below decks behind false bulkheads, staying absolutely still while the submarine studied the apparently abandoned ship through binoculars, and this waiting period could last 5 minutes or 30, while shells crashed through the superstructure only meters from hidden men who could not move and could not fire back until the perfect moment arrived. And so the stage was set for the deadly game that turned helpless cargo ships into torpedo traps and lured German submarines straight toward their destruction with nothing but rust-slow engines and the illusion of weakness. The moment a submarine rose to the surface to fire its deck gun, it became as exposed as any ordinary vessel and far more fragile, because the pressure hull of a Type U-31 submarine was built to endure the crushing force of water at 50 meters, but not the violent impact of a 12-pound shell which could split metal like tin. And yet the British Navy had spent most of its effort trying to hunt submarines underwater, where they were nearly impossible to track, and where depth charges, hydrophones and fast destroyers often worked blindly. And the idea behind the Q ship was therefore simple and brilliant. Instead of chasing a submarine into the deep force, it to come up willingly and attack by offering what appeared to be an easy kill, a slow, helpless merchant ship. And by turning the enemy doctrine back upon itself, the Admiralty created a trap that worked only because German commanders followed logical, efficient procedures, and one of the earliest ships built for this plan was HMS Farnborough, launched in March 1915, after starting her life as the Collier Lauder, a vessel of 2,400 tons built in the year 1895, exactly the kind of aging cargo ship that submarines love to destroy with cheap ammunition, and naval engineers hollowed out her interior and fitted 4 12-pound guns behind hinged panels, a 6-pounder in the stern, and a 3-pounder that looked like plain cargo from the deck, and a crew of 65 men wore rough merchant clothing, lived in cramped, dirty quarters, and spoke and behaved exactly like civilian sailors. And she flew a merchant flag and sent only distress signals, and she even leaked oil to appear crippled, and the disguise was so convincing that even seasoned sailors might have believed the ship belonged to a company too poor to maintain her. And critics at the Admiralty argued that the Q-ship program sent good men into floating coffins, depending on the enemy to make the wrong decision. But they misunderstood the tactic entirely, for the Q-ship did not rely on an enemy mistake. It relied on predictable enemy efficiency, because surfacing to use the deck gun against a harmless target, it was the smartest tactic a U-boat commander could choose, and the trap existed within this normal procedure. And one of the most important elements of the deception was the panic party drill, where 5 or 8 men on deck acted out scenes of chaos, shouting and stumbling and lowering a lifeboat with exaggerated clumsiness, rowing away as if desperate to escape the doomed ship. And they carried forged papers matching the false identity of the vessel, whether she claimed to be from Bergen, Genoa, or another neutral port, and the clothing worn was real merchant gear purchased from captured ships, and some officers practiced Norwegian, Danish or other neutral maritime phrases to sell the act. And one man from HMS Dunraven later recalled that the terror had to look real, because if the lifeboat moved too smoothly or the sailors looked too practiced, the submarine might sense a trap and dive before the hidden guns could be revealed. And while the panic party rowed away, the fighting crew stayed hidden behind false bulkheads or narrow compartments, where they waited without moving, listening to shells tear through the ship above them, and the waiting could stretch from 5 minutes to 30. And during this time, men crouched beside their weapons in silence, feeling the shock of explosions splintering, would only a few feet away, unable to see their attacker because the periscope or deck gun Of the submarine was their only clue, and there are accounts where Q ships like HMS Penturus took 7 direct hits during a single battle in September 1916, before her commander Lieutenant R.C. Stewart judged that the submarine was close enough to guarantee a hit and ordered the guns to be revealed, and the discipline required for such moments was exceptional. Dozens of men trapped in confined spaces, breathing in dust and smoke, listening to shell fire while waiting for a single command that might never come, and even the technical work of hiding the guns demanded ingenuity, because a 12-pounder quick-firing gun weighed about 610 kilograms and required a 5-man crew to operate efficiently, firing 15 rounds per minute, and each gun needed to cover a field of fire of about 270 degrees, yet had to remain completely invisible until the decisive second arrived, and naval architects designed hinged panels disguised as deck houses, cargo hatches, or even chicken coops. And these panels were counterweighted, so they could drop away the instant a latch was pulled, and gun crews practiced constantly to open panels, swing guns into position, and fire. First shot within 7 seconds on HMS Tamarisk commander, Francis Henry Grenfell demanded that his gun crews perform the entire drill under 6 seconds using stopwatches to measure every attempt, and Grenfell believed the submarine commander would have only 2 seconds to recognize the trap. Begin diving, and so the Q ship had to strike hard before the enemy vanished below the surface. And yet the deception did not end with hidden guns, for the very appearance of neglect was engineered. Rust streaks, uneven rolling, and thick smoke made by deliberately poor coal were all part of the act. HMS Result in 1917 even had her crew rust deck fittings with acid and scatter broken crates, ropes, and rusted chains to create the look of a ship whose owner could barely afford paint, let alone weapons, and these details mattered because German commanders sought out ships that looked weak, slow, and poorly handled, and the worse a Q ship looked, the more likely it was to be chosen, and the engagement between a submarine and a Q ship depended on precise distance, because a surfaced U-boat often fired from 800 to 1200 yards, close enough for accurate shelling, but far enough to dive safely if threatened. And though British 12-pounder guns had an effective range of 5,000 yards, their best accuracy came under 1,000, and the Q ship commander had to choose the perfect moment to reveal his weapons too early, and the submarine would dive too late. The submarine might sense something strange and escape, and Gordon Campbell, who commanded several Q ships including Farnborough and later Pagost, eventually shaped the standard method of engagement by allowing the submarine to approach closer and closer until escape became nearly impossible, and only then dropping the panels and opening fire, and these choices defined the razor-thin line between victory and death for every Q ship crew, waiting in silence for the decisive second when the trap would spring shut. HMS Penturus became one of the clearest examples of how brutal and demanding Q ship combat could be, for in September 1916, she endured 7 direct hits that smashed through her fragile upper works before her commander, Lieutenant R.C. Stewart, judged that the submarine had come close enough to ensure a killing shot, and only then did he signal his hidden gunners to reveal themselves and fire. And the level of patience required from every man aboard bordered on superhuman, because for long minutes they crouched behind thin bulkheads listening to shells ripping into their ships, unable to move or flinch as splinters and dust shook around them. And this was the true heart of the Q ship program: discipline under fire and absolute stillness in the face of destruction, and the technical challenge of concealing guns aboard such merchants was immense, because a 12-pounder quick-firing gun weighed roughly 610 kilograms counting its mounting, and needed a 5-man crew to operate it at maximum speed of 15 rounds in a minute. And every gun needed a broad field of fire nearly 270 degrees, yet had to remain completely invisible until the instant the disguise fell away, and naval constructors came up with countless trick designs where the guns sat behind hinged deck structures built to resemble ordinary hatches, cargo boxes, chicken coops, or deck houses. And these panels were counterweighted so that the moment a crewman released the latch, they swung down cleanly and opened the way for the guns, and the gunners rehearsed every movement endlessly. So when the command came, they released the catches, the panels dropped, the guns swung into firing position. and the first shot left the barrel all within a few heartbeats on HMS Tamarisk command. Francis Henry Grenfell drilled his gunners with stopwatches, demanding they complete the entire drill in under 6 seconds, because he calculated that a submarine commander had only about 2 seconds to understand the trap and begin diving, and Grenfell wrote that they had to hit the submarine before it slipped below the surface, because once submerged the target became almost impossible to destroy. And yet even these hidden guns were only part of the deception, for the Q ships were built to look appalling, neglected, and barely seaworthy. And these flaws were not accidental, but carefully engineered to increase the chances of being targeted by a U-boat, and crews used poor coal deliberately to produce thick dark smoke that made their engines look strained, and they varied speed in erratic ways to mimic failing machinery, and they tilted their ships slightly to one side to look badly loaded. Damaged an HMS Result operating in 1917 took the art even further by having her crew apply an acid wash on deck fittings to create real rust and scattering broken crates, rope fragments, and rusted chains across the deck to give the honest appearance of a vessel whose owners had long abandoned maintenance, and one officer said they looked like a ship whose owners could barely afford paint, let alone hidden guns. And this was precisely the point, because German submarine commanders preferred to attack the weakest and slowest ships, those that appeared completely helpless, and these visual clues made such targets more appealing and increased the chance that a U-boat would surface and come within lethal range. And the geometry of Q-ship engagements was always exacting and unforgiving, because a surfaced U-boat usually opened fire from between 800 and 1200 yards, and this distance allowed accurate shelling while also giving enough room to crash dive if threatened. And though British 12-pound guns could reach far up to 5,000 yards, their best accuracy came at less than 1,000, and the Q-ship commander carried the burden of choosing the perfect moment when to reveal the trap, because if he acted too soon, the submarine would dive untouched, and if he waited too long, the submarine might notice something odd, perhaps the way the ship handled damage, or the way the supposed abandoned deck crew behaved, and then escape. And Gordon Campbell, the officer who would become the most famous Q-ship commander, carved out the doctrine that most others eventually followed. He allowed the submarine to come dangerously close, sometimes far closer than any sane commander would tolerate before firing, because he believed the enemy had to be fully committed, fully convinced that the target was helpless with lookouts relaxed and the deck gun firing confidently before the trap could be sprung. And he wrote that the submarine must be allowed to settle into that false sense of control so deeply that by the time he realized something was wrong, it would be far too late, and to create that illusion, crews had to endure a terrifying barrage before the moment of action, for the enemy shells often cut through masts, cargo structures, and rails, sending splinters flying and filling compartments with choking dust, as the men inside held their breath, refusing to stir even as pieces of their ship fell around them. And every minute spent waiting increased the danger, because one unlucky hit could detonate ammunition or kill a hidden gun crew before they ever fired, and yet this dreadful patience was the very currency of the Q-ship strategy. Everything depended on timing and surprise, and the engagement data collected from 150 actions revealed the stark reality, because when Q-ships opened fire at ranges beyond 700 yards, they achieved kills in only a small fraction of cases, while engagements at 500 yards or less had dramatically higher success, some reaching over half the encounters ending in a destroyed submarine. And these numbers proved that the tactic required almost suicidal courage, allowing the enemy to come as close as possible, so that when the guns finally roared, the submarine had no chance to dive, and this waiting under fire demanded nerves stronger than steel. And while many outside the service criticized the strategy, calling it wasteful or too dangerous, they failed to see the greater truth that every minute a submarine spent on the surface inspecting a target increased its vulnerability to destroyers, aircraft, and other Q-ships. And though the Q-ships themselves achieved only a handful of confirmed kills, their real value lay in changing the behavior of the German submarine fleet and forcing commanders to act with caution, where once they acted with confidence. And this shift in mindset across the enemy force was the true success born from the deadly patience displayed by the men who waited behind false panels while shells hammered their ships above them. Gordon Campbell refined the Q-ship method into a razor-sharp doctrine built on patience, bravery, and the cold understanding that the submarine must be allowed to believe it controlled the fight before the trap snapped shut. And he mastered this strategy across several commands, including Farnborough, and later Barges, where he perfected the art of letting the enemy come shockingly close before revealing the hidden guns. And one of his most famous actions occurred on the 7th of June 1917, when Barges sailed under the disguise of a harmless merchant named Victoria, and U-29 spotted her and closed in to attack, and Campbell allowed the submarine to fire shell after shell into his ship for 25 minutes, enduring 24 hits that tore away her main mast-shattered planks and started fires across the deck, while his hidden crews lay pressed against bulkheads, breathing hot smoke and feeling the ship tremble from each violent impact. And still Campbell refused to give the order because the submarine had not yet come close enough to guarantee destruction. And his men waited in that burning wreck, listening to the whistle of incoming rounds smashing into the ship, while the panic party acted out their desperate scramble into the lifeboat, rowing away with frantic strokes, meant to convince the enemy that the ship had been abandoned. And finally, when U-29 drifted within about 350 yards, preparing to deliver the finishing blow, Campbell ordered the panels dropped, and the guns pivoted out, and the first 3 shots struck the conning tower and pressure hull with devastating accuracy. And in only 90 seconds, the submarine slipped beneath the waves, destroyed before it had any chance to dive or escape. And this action became a benchmark for every Q-ship commander because it demonstrated the critical importance of range, timing, and surprise. And after the war, analysts studied 150 recorded engagements, and the data revealed a brutal truth: for if a Q-ship opened fire at more than 700 yards, the odds of destroying a submarine dropped to only a handful of cases. But if the first shot rang out at 500 yards or closer, the chances of sinking the submarine rose dramatically, and in some groups exceeded 60%. And so the numbers proved that success depended on extraordinary nerve, because the Q-ship had to endure heavy attack waiting for the perfect second where the submarine was too close to react yet still confident enough to keep firing. And critics claimed this cost too many lives because 11 confirmed kills from 366 Q-ships seemed a poor return, but those critics missed the wider strategic impact because the Q-ship campaign forced German doctrine to change, and that change weakened the entire U-boat system. German commanders began to fear that any harmless-looking merchant ship might be a deadly trap, and this made them far more cautious in every encounter. They spent longer studying targets before surfacing and exposed themselves to greater danger from destroyers and aircraft, and many chose to rely more heavily on torpedoes instead of the cheaper deck gun. But torpedoes were expensive, limited in number, and every wasted shot shortened duration of their patrols and reduced the number of ships they could sink, and a submarine that used all 16 torpedoes on unarmed merchants had to return to port perhaps 15 days earlier than planned, and this alone cut their effectiveness severely. And so the Q-ships did not need to destroy dozens of submarines to win. They only had to change how submarines behaved, and by mid-1916 this transformation was complete because U-boat commanders no longer saw slow, rusting merchant ships as easy prey, but as possible killers waiting to strike, and the psychological burden carried by these submarine crews grew heavier with each encounter because they could not be sure whether the clumsy lifeboat filled with shouting men was real terror or staged deception. And many captured officers later admitted that this doubt slowed their decision-making and made them hesitate before surfacing, and each moment of hesitation exposed them to aircraft patrolling above or destroyers sweeping the horizon, and this delay saved untold merchant ships from destruction. And even though Q-ships paid a terrible price with 61 lost and 289 crew killed, the sacrifice ensured that the wider merchant fleet suffered fewer losses, and Britain remained supplied at a time when starvation and blockade were real threats and life aboard these disguised vessels became a test of endurance because men lived for months in unhealthy, cramped, foul conditions deliberately chosen to mimic genuine merchant life, and they trained endlessly practicing the panic party, drill, the rapid gun reveal, and all the steps needed to transform from helpless target to lethal ambush. And every day they woke in the same rust-streaked cabins, surrounded by rotten wood, coal dust, and the stench of oil, never knowing whether that day would bring another encounter that required them to lie still while shells crashed into the deck overhead, and many Q ship commanders wrote in their logs about the psychological strain that came not during the gunfight, but during the waiting moments when death seemed seconds away, yet they could not resist or retaliate until the exact signal was given. And this mental pressure created a rare kind of courage, one rooted not in charges or sudden assaults, but in enduring helplessness until the decisive strike could be made, and Campbell often wrote that true battle of the Q ship was the battle of patience, and that victory belonged to those who could remain silent, still, and hidden until the very last instant, when the enemy believed all resistance was gone, and only then reveal the teeth behind the disguise, and this was the strange genius of the Q ship system, built on deception, suffering, and perfect timing. And it worked because it exploited the logical, disciplined nature of the U-boat commanders, who acted exactly as doctrine taught them, and in doing so sailed themselves into carefully prepared traps. The men who served aboard the Q ships carried a burden unlike any other sailors in the Royal Navy, because their mission demanded not only skill and gunnery discipline, but months of pretending to be helpless, laboring in filth and discomfort, while hoping that someday a submarine would appear and give them a chance to fight back. And many of these volunteers endured long, lonely patrols without ever sighting an enemy. And sometimes the waiting itself seemed more punishing than battle, because each day they rose in the same cramped, foul-smelling quarters that imitated genuine merchant conditions, with peeling paint rust, stained walls, and leaking roofs, and every object aboard had to fit the disguise, even the clothing and equipment used by the crew. And one commander who felt this strain deeply was Lieutenant William Sanders, who led HMS Heligoland disguised as a worn coastal trader, and in 1916 he spent 4 months at sea without seeing a single U-boat, and his men rehearsed their drills over and over again, lowering the panic party boat, climbing into secret compartments, and swinging the hidden guns into firing position, and the repetition built a rhythm that sustained them through boredom and hunger, but also sharpened them for the day when a real submarine finally appeared. And on the 30th of April 1917, that moment came when U-93 closed in and opened fire at long range, and Sanders' crew moved exactly as they had practiced with the panic party, stumbling into the lifeboat with frantic gestures, and the hidden gunners waiting silently behind thin planks while the enemy shells crashed into the ship. And when the submarine drew close enough, the guns burst into action and hammered U-93 until she fled, leaking oil and trailing air bubbles, and limped back to Germany for repairs that lasted 4 months. And for this Sanders was awarded the Victoria Cross, a rare honor earned by enduring months of hardship before a few minutes of perfect execution. And yet only 5 months later he died when another submarine torpedoed his next command, HMS Prize, before he could spring the trap, and his end reflected the grim truth that the Q ship service demanded everything from its volunteers: their time, their strength, and often their lives. And on many ships the panic party faced even greater danger, because these men were the ones forced to row away in small open boats, while the U-boat shelled the Q ship, not knowing whether the submarine would spare them or rake their lifeboat with machine gun fire. And their role required them to look terrified while being perfectly calm inside, rowing in sloppy, uneven strokes to maintain the act, and carrying forged papers to show the submarine commander if they were captured. And if the Q ship sank, or if the trap failed, the panic party might drift for days across open water, hoping to be found by friendly ships or fishing vessels. And there were many occasions when panic parties watched their ship torpedoed and sunk after the deception failed, and they could do nothing but sit in their fragile lifeboat watching the wreck settle into the water, and then survive as best they could until rescue came. And yet, despite all these dangers, Q ship crews were volunteers, and there was never a shortage of men willing to serve, because many came from the Royal Naval Reserve and had merchant experience, which made them perfect candidates to play the roles required by the disguise, and others were merchant seamen whose own ships had been torpedoed earlier in the war, and they signed up for the Q ship program, seeking revenge for lost friends or shattered livelihoods, and discipline problems were almost non-existent because the mission demanded a level of commitment that filtered out the unwilling long before a patrol began. And ship's logs show hour after hour of practice, runs with gunners competing to reduce their time from concealed to first shot, fired, and damage control teams running repeated drills to patch holes or seal compartments quickly. and the ships themselves took a relentless beating from weather and from the strain of maintaining their disguise, because a vessel meant to look decrepit must behave decrepit, and this meant real wear on engines, fittings, and hull planks. And the men constantly worked to keep the illusion believable without letting the ship fall apart for real. And even though the crews worked tirelessly, German submarine commanders were not fools, and by late 1916, they began adapting their tactics to counter Q ships, and they grew more cautious about approaching too closely and studied every suspicious detail through binoculars, the angle at which the ship listed, the way she responded to the helm, the nature of the distress signals sent from her spar, the behavior of the supposed panic party, and some U-boats began firing a few shots and then diving to resurface at another angle to see whether the ship moved or if more men appeared on deck. And in this way, the Q ship campaign turned into a duel of intelligence and counterintelligence, each side learning from the other, and the Admiralty responded by creating more sophisticated disguises, including elaborate false cargo, such as timber stacked across the deck lavestock, penned near the bow, or even motorcars lashed to rails to give the appearance of a genuine commercial run. And one of the most impressive examples was HMS Hyderabad, deployed in 1917, disguised as an American vessel complete with American flags, forged papers, and crew members who could mimic an American accent convincingly. And when U-105 stopped her in September 1917, Lieutenant C.M. Hamlin, playing the role of the merchant captain, argued in a flawless Boston accent about American neutrality, while holding forged documents and speaking with such confidence that the submarine commander grew uncertain and eventually dove without firing, leaving Hyderabad alive, though without a kill. And this showed how deep the deception had grown, because now the Q ships were not only trying to lure submarines close enough to destroy, but also to survive intense scrutiny and psychological inspection from men trained to detect lies and illusions. And the war of trickery continued to evolve as the struggle intensified across the Atlantic. By the end of 1916, German submarine doctrine had shifted noticeably, because commanders no longer trusted the simple sight of an unarmed merchant ship, and instead approached every target with suspicion and hesitation, and many submarine captains now kept a wider distance, watching a ship for long minutes through binoculars, searching for any hint that she might be a trap. And they looked for unnatural rolls in the water, for signs of hidden bulkheads, for odd movements on deck, or for lifeboats that did not behave quite like terrified sailors would behave. And some U-boats even adopted a new method where they fired a few ranging shots from a safe distance, and then dove immediately and resurfaced a quarter-hour later from a different angle to see whether the supposedly abandoned ship had changed position or revealed any signs of life. And this constant testing illustrated how the Q ship campaign had become a battle of minds, where every movement, every signal, and every detail mattered, and the Admiralty understood that if the enemy had become sharper, then the deception had to grow more elaborate as well. And so the next generation of Q ships carried false cargo arranged with great care, including real timber on deck crates, stacked with believable weight, even livestock in pens, to replicate the look and smell of a working merchantman. And some carried abandoned-looking automobiles, tied down with ropes to strengthen the image of a vessel engaged in ordinary trade routes. And HMS Hyderabad became one of the most striking examples when she sailed in 1917, disguised as an American merchant, complete with carefully forged papers, flags, and crew members who could speak with convincing American accents. And when U-105 stopped her in September 1917, and the panic party captain, Lieutenant C.M. Hamlin, spoke in a perfect Boston accent while presenting the forged documents, the German commander grew uncertain of the ship's true nature and chose to dive rather than risk close engagement. And though Hyderabad did not score a kill, she survived an inspection that would have exposed many other Q ships, and this showed how refined the deception had become, because it now required cultural mimicry, fluent speech, false national identities, and precise acting to match the story written in the ship's fabricated documents. And yet some ideas proved too unwieldy to maintain, such as the short-lived tactic of towing British submarines behind Q ships, because in 1917, HMS Taranaki attempted this strategy by towing a British E-class submarine 400 yards behind her, connected by a telephone cable. And the plan was simple: when German U-boat fired on Taranaki, the towed British submarine would release the cable slip underwater and torpedo the attacker from behind while the Q ship engaged from the front. And though this bold experiment worked once on the 23rd of June 1917, when HM submarine C-27 torpedoed UC-44 while she shelled Taranaki, it was quickly abandoned because the method was too dangerous, too complicated, and tied up two vessels when one Q ship might accomplish the job alone. And so the Admiralty shifted to a different idea: decoy ships that were meant to look like Q ships rather than the other way around. And by 1917, German intelligence had collected descriptions and grainy photographs of several Q ships that had survived battles, so the Admiralty deployed ordinary unarmed merchantmen that had been altered to resemble Q ships with suspicious deck structures and false gun positions in plain sight. And the goal of these decoy ships was not to kill U-boats, but to provoke uncertainty in the German commander's mind, making him think he might be facing a trap. And if the German submarine wasted a torpedo on one of these decoys rather than using its deck gun, then the British gained a victory, because a torpedo spent on a worthless target could not be used against a real merchant carrying food or fuel. And even better, if the German submarine avoided the suspicious-looking ship altogether, then the decoy had done its job simply by existing, because it prevented an attack and forced the enemy to behave more cautiously. And through this layered web of disguises, the British achieved something rare in naval warfare. They created confusion so deep that it influenced the enemy's entire way of thinking, and this mattered more than any single engagement. Because German U-boat doctrine had once been clear, rational, and efficient, but now it was clouded with doubt, and every patrol became slower and more dangerous for the submarine crews. And German officers later admitted that the constant fear of Q ships made them hesitate before surfacing and watch targets longer and look for traps in every direction. And this hesitation placed them at greater risk from patrolling aircraft or destroyers closing in from the horizon. And the Q ship program succeeded not because it relied on superior weapons or faster ships, but because it weaponized the enemy's own doctrine and turned their logical decisions into liabilities. For whenever a U-boat commander surfaced to attack a weak merchant, he was following the best practices taught by his navy. But the Q ship took that correct logical decision and transformed it into vulnerability. And by forcing the boat commanders to question their usual methods, the British achieved what their warships alone could not: the ability to slow the pace of the submarine threat across the entire Atlantic. And every moment a submarine spent observing, studying, or reconsidering a target was a moment it was not sinking. A merchant ship and fewer merchant losses meant more supplies reaching Britain and more time won in a war of endurance. And thus the Q ships, even when they failed in combat, still succeeded in shaping the battlefield by infecting the enemy with uncertainty and hesitation, the two invisible weapons that haunted U-boat crews for the rest of the war. By the later years of the war, the entire German submarine strategy had been reshaped by the invisible pressure created by the Q ship campaign, because what had once been a clean, predictable doctrine built on logic and efficiency had turned into a landscape filled with doubt and second-guessing. And this shift revealed a profound truth about warfare: that the best tactics on paper meant nothing when the enemy refused to behave in the expected way. And German U-boats were faster, better armed, and more advanced than the disguised merchant ships that hunted them, yet those advantages counted for little once commanders no longer trusted what they saw. And the great irony of the Q ship program was that it did not rely on mistakes made by the submarine captains, but on the fact that these officers acted correctly, exactly as their manuals instructed. And it was this correctness that the British used against them. For a U-boat commander who surfaced to shell a weak merchant was not reckless but efficient, performing the most practical method of attack available. And the Q ship twisted this sensible decision into a lethal vulnerability, and the psychological effect of this transformation grew steadily year by year as more German officers encountered suspicious ships or heard reports from comrades who had narrowly escaped traps. And the fear of Q ships lodged itself deep into the minds of the submarine crews, and captured officers interrogated after their vessels were destroyed spoke openly about this tension, describing how every merchant ship became a question, a threat, a puzzle that could not be solved with certainty. And one officer, Captain Lieutenant Klaus Rucker, who survived the loss of U-34 after being deceived by HMS Stonecrop in November 1918, said that they spent more time watching targets than attacking them because they feared hidden guns or false decks, and he explained how the need to observe extended every encounter and kept the submarine on the surface longer than was safe exposing it to aircraft and patrolling destroyers, and these admissions showed the true strategic value of the Q ships, for the goal had never been to rack up dozens of submarine kills, but to change the behavior of the enemy fleet as a whole and make every U-boat less efficient, slower, and more vulnerable, and across the Atlantic results began to show because torpedo inventories depleted, faster patrol durations shortened, and surface attacks diminished in number and effectiveness for the simple reason that submarine captains no longer trusted the easy kills they once relied upon, and the deeper principle behind this victory was that superiority in technology or firepower can be undone entirely when the enemy undermines the assumptions that strategy depends upon, and the Q ships proved that even a rusty cargo vessel could become more dangerous than a warship if the enemy did not know how to read its intentions. And by 1918, however, the campaign was beginning to fade because the Germans had adopted unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, which meant they no longer needed to surface before attacking and instead fired torpedoes at all vessels, including neutrals, without warning. And this shift reduced the opportunities for Q ships to spring their traps, since they relied entirely on the submarine coming within close range on the surface. And at the same time, the British introduced the convoy system, where merchant ships traveled in guarded groups under destroyer escort, and this lowered the number of isolated targets wandering alone across the ocean, and thus fewer chances for German submarines to make surface attacks at all. And as these twin developments reshaped the battlefield, the role of Q ships diminished naturally, though they did continue to fight whenever a rare chance appeared, and even in these waning months the courage of their crews remained undiminished, and though the confirmed tally of submarine kills remained only 11, the impact of the campaign could not be measured solely by numbers, because a single Q ship forced dozens of U-boats to behave more cautiously for months, and this multiplied effect shaped patrol patterns and slowed the sinking of British merchant tonnage far more than any direct kill count could show. And the legacy of the Q ships rested not in the steel of their hidden guns, but in the fear they planted in enemy minds, a fear powerful enough to alter rhythm of the war at sea, and this achievement stands as one of the earliest examples of asymmetric naval warfare, where the weaker side used deception and irregular methods to undermine a superior foe, and modern navies continue to study this example long after the war, because the principle remained relevant that when you cannot match your enemy in strength, you force him to question every move and every target, and this hesitation becomes a weapon more potent than ammunition. And even as the Q ship era closed, its influence spread into new ideas such as merchant vessels carrying concealed missile systems during the Cold War or modern naval